Countdown, two, one. Hello, Dylan. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Aidan.
Yeah. So, Dylan, you are co-founder and CEO of Mindstate Design Labs. I'm sorry, based out of Western PA, down there a little bit southwest of Pittsburgh. Before we go there, though, definitely want to have you come on and tell us a little bit about yourself and what should we know about you?
Yeah, thanks. So my professional background started in finance. I did a lot of mergers and acquisitions at the beginning of my career and then moved into venture capital. So I worked for the internal venture arm of a large hospital system and insurance company out here on the East Coast, headquartered in Pittsburgh. Did a wide variety of venture investing in different kinds of modalities. There was health tech, med devices, small molecules, gene therapy, really across the board, also in the sense of indications, many different disease areas. I had the investing role, but then also would take an operations role when we did spinout companies, companies that were almost nothing but science, just ready to be commercialized. So I would help stand the company up and get it off the ground. So that's my background. In I guess summer of 2021, started Mindstate Design Labs, went through the Y Combinator Accelerator in the Bay Area. And I guess since then have been working on bringing psychedelic therapeutics to people who need them for mental health disorders.
Now, what is Y Combinator? I'm not really familiar with that. Like, what is that?
Yeah, more of a business niche thing. So an accelerator is an organization that takes early stage ideas or teams or startups and is often one of the first checks in the round. And there's typically some education around how to run a company and how to raise funding and some diligence, and they help with connections. So Y Combinator, I think, was maybe the first, probably the most commonly known of those types of accelerators.
Now, initially, when you first graduated, because you graduated from RMU, Robert Morris, with your MBA, how do you get into, I don't know, the science field, if that makes sense? You know what I mean? How do you initially do that with a business background? I'm really in the dark here about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think coming from business and investing, it gives you a bit of optionality to go into different industries. So at the very beginning of my career, I saw manufacturing companies and oil and gas companies and tech companies and just really any industry here. And it gives you an idea of what you find most interesting and where you want to invest your time. And I heard some advice from, I don't remember who it was, some venture capitalist at some point who said that the most important decision you can make in your career is to find a big wave. What is the thing that over the course of the next 30 years is just going to explode? So if you were the best typewriter salesman in the world in, I don't know, 1980, you probably didn't have the greatest career, but if you were a mediocre computer programmer, you did pretty well. And so it seemed to me that the 21st century was going to be the century of biotech. And it just inspired me that by better understanding of the human body and the human mind, we can make a real difference in people's lives.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, so I kind of have two questions then for you. One is first of all, what is Mindstate Design Labs? What sets you guys apart from other one, I guess psychedelic companies, but also just pharmaceutical companies? What is the distinction? But also two, how were you approached to start this startup? Because I don't know, again, if you're because obviously you're kind of the business end of it. So were you one initially with the idea, or were you approached by someone else and say, hey, look, I think we should get into psychedelics? Or so how did that all start?
Yeah, so when I was in my venture investing role, I would just stay abreast of what was happening on the cutting edge of medicine. And this area of psychedelics was one thing that just really intrigued me. Didn't have any investments in the space, but had my own personal experience. I was an early adopter. There's some ways you could legally get psychedelic experience through some religious protection and some different jurisdictions. And so I saw that have a huge huge impact on my own life. And so I saw both the promise of that type of therapy and also the mechanism. And so I had just been reaching out to people in the field, just learning about the field. And my scientific co-founder, Dr. Thomas Ray, was one who really shared my vision and my obsession with this one particular thing, which is the variety of psychedelic experience. So these drugs are sometimes seen as one monolithic entity. It's just hallucinations, but these are a number of different classes of compounds, and even compounds within one class can have very different effects. And so what really inspired me, and what's our mission at Mindstate Design Labs, is to map the biological basis of that immense variety of different states of consciousness that can be induced for therapeutic purposes using psychedelics. And so that's what really makes us stand apart. We recognize the acute subjective experience of the non-ordinary state of consciousness as being central to therapeutic outcomes. And what we care about is specifically designing the drug, designing the experience to specifically induce that state of consciousness that is going to be most therapeutic for a given disease indication.
That's really cool. So how does this might be proprietary, I don't know, but like, how does the process work? So let's say like, I don't know, say, I guess you have patients, right? I guess they come in and say, hey, look, I have like, or I guess maybe you do some testing to see like, I don't know, like, how does the process work to see like I don't want to say what's wrong with them, but you know what I'm saying? And then like, you like, I don't know, give them psychedelic? Like, how does that work?
Right. So we're a preclinical stage company. So we're in animal testing right now, just moved into large animals, and we'll start human trials, hopefully file our IND later this year and get into humans.
Awesome.
But the way that psychedelic therapy works is once these things are approved, and not many of these types of therapies have been approved, but once they're approved, they will be prescribed by a physician, and the patient will typically have a period of preparation. So there's work with a therapist. Often these drugs themselves are not the treatment. They're used as adjuncts to psychotherapy or adjuncts to some type of therapy. And so you would have the patient come in, start the therapy. There would then be a session where the drug would actually be administered. And this is typically in a very controlled setting. So that, you're not at the typical scenario you would think of for psychedelic consumption. You're in a clinic with a medical professional. Often the patient will be laying down on a couch with a blanket, often with eye shades. The goal is to reduce sensory information. And the medical professional there is mostly there for psychological support, just mostly there to remind the patients that if they start to experience anxiety, for example, that's, they're in a safe place and everything's okay. And that's really the process for psychedelic therapy, which is very different from your typical pharmaceutical where you just send a pill home. And these do need to be supervised usually because there is some profound change to consciousness, to mood or cognition or emotion in some sense. So that's what psychedelic therapy looks like. And what we're working on is more on the preclinical side, in silico and in vitro and in vivo studies, where we're drawing this map first. So from a drug development perspective, fundamentally, we're a target discovery company. You have to do target discovery before you do drug development. You want to know what sites in the brain you need to design a drug to hit before you can design the drug to do that. And so that's where we are.
I took a drug development class, I think last spring. Super fun class, but man, medicinal chemistry. It's pretty fascinating how like different little changes in a structure can like extremely change like the outcome of a drug. It's really fascinating, honestly. Now, how competitive is the psychedelic market? Is it because I guess fundamentally, if you're not in it for the money, but also like just generally help people, I'm sure that makes it easier. But like other like psychedelic companies, let's say across the nation or even like the East Coast, or like, how does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. Hundreds psychedelics companies. A lot of those are split between different areas of the emerging industry. So there are drug development companies like us. There are infrastructure companies building out the actual clinics needed to deliver this therapy. There's the more of the tech-focused companies building out the the supporting infrastructure of the IT to operate these clinics, many different areas here. But the psychedelics industry has really boomed. I think, don't quote me on this, but I think 2.5 billion in investment was the last figure I saw.
Mm.
So many publicly traded companies at this point. It's becoming a maturing industry. So yeah, definitely things have boomed as a result of some late stage clinical trials
Mm-hmm.
that have read out recently. So back in 2021, when I started this, it was a little bit more of a fringe industry still, whereas
Mm-hmm.
today it's commonly viewed as an inevitability by regulators, clinicians, and researchers in the space that psychedelic therapy will become a thing in the near future.
Mm-hmm. What is like the history of psychedelics? Because like, what I mean, why does it have such a like a negative connotation? Like why? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like why do people
Yeah.
care so much?
Right. Well, the history goes back tens of thousands of years. So
Mm.
indigenous societies have been using these compounds for religious purposes, for medicinal purposes, for long before history began to be recorded. But I think what happened is globalization in the 20th century, just that the world becoming more connected and the Western societies all of a sudden rediscovering some of these indigenous societies who were using psilocybin mushrooms, for example.
Mm.
There was then the discovery of LSD by Albert Hoffman. There were a number of events in the, let's call it the early 20th century. And many of these drugs actually were used as pharmaceuticals, were used as therapy drugs before they escaped onto the street. But in the 1960s, these compounds became very associated with and entangled with the certain subcultures. So the anti-war movement, and it became very much a political thing and a moral panic. There's a famous quote from a high-level Nixon administration official saying that they knew they were lying about the drugs, but their enemies were hippies and black people, and they couldn't arrest people for being hippies or black, but they could criminalize the drugs those people used and then
Mm.
invade their homes, arrest their leaders, so forth. So definitely political motivations there. There's also very much a legitimate reason that these things became highly regulated.
Mm.
And that is if you are in an uncontrolled environment and using improper doses with improper intentions, things can very much go wrong. So most of these compounds are very physically safe. They're not addictive, but the hallucinations do happen and
Yeah.
the anxiety does happen. And so if it's not in a controlled setting with a medical professional, things go wrong, and things did go wrong. And
Yeah.
so that led to the criminalization in the 70s.
So I know you're not a physician, but I've done, I've had two psychedelic experiences. I had those like mushroom chocolates, and one of them was when I was in like Tampa Bay with my buddies. I took a piece, and like we were on the beach like in Clearwater. I mean, it was like the one of the best experiences of my life. Um, just the vibes were just immaculate. I don't like, I just so good. So it was a beautiful day out. And then the second time was I was in a bar with like a few of my friends, and the music was great, and like we were just dancing, having a good time. Um, so in your experience, I mean, have you seen people with like bad trips on psychedelics? Like, what does like a bad trip even like look like?
Yeah. So it's highly dependent on dosing. It's
Mm.
also dependent on, in psychedelics, we talk about set and setting. So the mindset of the individual, their history, their expectations and intentions and vulnerabilities, and then the setting, the environment in which the experience occurs. So this means the social environment, also the cultural environment of the experience. And so it sounds like in your experiences, many of those things were tilted in the right direction. But for someone with a background of having mental health disorder,
Mm.
people who have trauma in their backgrounds, even repressed trauma that they don't really consciously know about, these kinds of things can come up in the trip.
Mm.
Often also there's a period of anxiety at the beginning of the trip. So for psilocybin, for example, it's roughly the first hour or so. And if if it's in an environment where the environment influences the trip, something could have happened while you're, out there with your friends. There could be a law enforcement situation. There could be a medical emergency. There could just be some sort of social incident, a fight between friends. And so those kinds of things, the individual becomes much more impressionable and much more reactive. And so any kind of negative input can quickly spiral out of control.
Now, are there certain, because I know you guys are doing you guys are making target compounds. I'm sure you guys have some targets you guys are trying to make, which I feel like a general audience might not know what that is. What I will say though is that I assume you guys aren't selling, like, let's say, the traditional shrooms, psilocybin, LSD, DMT. I assume you guys aren't doing those things. You guys are doing like maybe relatively similar compounds, but not like those exactly. You know what I'm saying?
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
So compounds that do engage similar targets, but not compounds you would have heard of.
And okay. So how, like, what sort of disorders and diseases are you guys trying to target? Because I feel like there's definitely a spectrum. There's obviously going to be a spectrum of like mental disorder. And so, for example, PTSD and the severity of PTSD in different people. So is there certain like targets you guys are trying to shoot for, like on that spectrum? Or are you guys trying to keep it more broad?
So early studies with psychedelics indicate that they're likely applicable in a broad variety of mental health disorders, whichever ones are associated with basically a narrow mental and behavioral repertoire. So depression, anxiety, PTSD, OCD, substance use disorders, anorexia, things along those lines are very appropriate for psychedelics. On the other end of the spectrum, you have disorders like schizophrenia, where the problem isn't narrowness, it's too much entropy. And because psychedelics increase that entropy because they dissolve boundaries and have those kinds of effects, they're not as appropriate for the schizophrenia spectrum of mental health disorders. And so, yeah, we'll go after a number of different disorders with different compounds.
That's really cool. Yeah, I didn't know that. That kind of makes sense now that, like, people with schizophrenia wouldn't necessarily do well on, let's say, psychedelics. That's really interesting. I didn't know that. Now, things like powerful trips like dimethyltryptamine, which from what I've never taken, although I got to be completely honest, I do want to try one day, where the trip is like, 10, 15 minutes, I think, at least anecdotally. That's what I've heard. Powerful things like that, is that also on the docket, or is that like, not really? Is that kind of like a singular case?
Yeah, DMT just had a readout. I believe this was January of 2023, so very recently here, had a phase 2A trial readout. If off the top of my head, I think it was something like a 56% remission in depression, a relatively small number of patients. But yes, all of these compounds, the classical psychedelics of DMT, LSD, psilocybin, and mescaline, are all being explored in clinical trials. Other common psychedelics like 5-MeO-DMT, this is the toad venom, are also being explored, as well as a number of new compounds.
Isn't it true that our body produces DMT, like dimethyltryptamine? Is that true, or am I making? Is that plants?
It is in very small amounts, and it's in plants as well. As far as we know, it's in every plant we've tested for DMT. So nature is drenched in DMT is the classic quote. Yeah.
So in a perfect world, let's say these, I'm going to be an optimist here. Let's say these trials go, you make it through human trials, let's say, and it's successful. What would be like what's the most ideal situation for you? Like, so you have clinics set up across the East Coast, you have patients coming in, I don't know, they get screened for whatever the disorder is, and then they get their psychedelic. Is that kind of like the goal, the ultimate goal?
Yes, we would interface with existing clinics. So any psychiatrist could prescribe this medication or the drug therapy combination. And so there would be clinics, not necessarily that we would own, but just any clinic across the world, probably more focused in the US and Europe in the short term, but hopefully expanding from there. So yeah, we're again preclinical, so a number of years here before our drugs, our second generation drugs, start to make it to the market. But you do have esketamine, which is an enantiomer of ketamine, developed by Johnson and Johnson, that is already on the market. Not particularly psychedelic, and it's a dissociative, which is a subcategory of hallucinogens. But that's been approved already, has been for a few years here. We should probably see approval of MDMA in May of 2024. And so I think that's when you'll start seeing these things becoming a lot more common.
Yeah. So how did you did you grow up in the Pittsburgh area, or where you originally from?
Yeah. Born in North Carolina, but raised in Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
Still here.
Pittsburgh. I grew up in King of Prussia, so just outside of Philadelphia. So Pennsylvania life. Very nice. I've been to Pittsburgh like twice. And I mean, God, it is such a very underrated city, because obviously when people think of Pennsylvania, if they think of Pennsylvania at all, they think Philadelphia. In fact, many people just think Philadelphia is like its own thing. They don't even know it's in Pennsylvania. And Pittsburgh is just kind of out there. It's a very clean city.
It's an old steel city, and I think basically collapsed. When was it? Maybe the 70s or so, when the steel industry collapsed, and then became replaced just by tech and healthcare. So with the University of Pittsburgh, which is I think it depends on the year, but I think last I checked, number 3 in NIH funding, just tons of research funding flowing into the University of Pittsburgh. Carnegie Mellon is their top computer and robotics school, and the hospital systems and the whole tech health ecosystem there is really strong.
It's got it all there, man. Pittsburgh is really cool. So how come like you decided to go to Robert Morris University? What was it about it? You just wanted to stay like near the Pittsburgh area? I actually didn't even know it was in Pittsburgh. I thought it was like Maryland or Virginia for some reason.
Yeah. Basically, I don't know. Long story short, just happened to have a full ride there, and wanted to get in and out as quickly as possible. So ended up doing my undergrad and master's in 3 years, and I just wanted to start getting out in the world and working and making things happen.
Dude, you're like so young for being a CEO too. Like definitely like aspire to do that kind of stuff. So how does it feel to be like, running this psychedelic company at your age? Like, how does it feel?
I just feel incredibly lucky to be surrounded by the people I'm surrounded with, just on a day-to-day basis. The conversations I'm having in the rooms I'm in, it's just amazing to be a part of those conversations, which are really on the cutting edge and maybe not happening anywhere else. I've always tried to surround myself with people who are smarter than me, and I've been very fortunate to find myself in that position, and just always learning and growing, and spending all my time and effort doing something that I find very meaningful. So I feel very fortunate.
Yeah. So for your company though, so how do the pitch meeting goes? Because obviously you got to get investments to start doing this stuff. So how do those pitches go? Like what is the message, and how do you get these people to invest in the company?
So I went through, again, Y Combinator, which is a bit of a different format than what I was used to. So I coming from more of a traditional biotech VC background, you're dealing with a relatively smaller number of investors. These tend to be large VC funds. You might get one or a few VC funds in your initial round, called the seed funding round. Going through the Y Combinator process, it's very different. So dealing with smaller investors who focus across different industries, who are industry agnostic, who tend to write smaller checks, who some of them might be just angel investors. So as opposed to VC funds, you just have individuals who are investing their own money. And so that results in a really wide variety of types of meetings. Sometimes it's just you get an email and the person wants to invest, and you don't even need a conversation. The extreme low end. Sometimes
very nice way to do it, I guess.
Yes. Yeah, well, it's quick at least. But then you also have more involved diligence processes where you might have a Zoom call, you might meet in person. There's typically a slide deck that you run through with the key points about the company and its competitive advantage and its team and the technology, and the key aspects of a company that investors will want to know about. From there, you'll typically have what's called a data room. So these are all virtual now, but you'll just have a website where all this information about the details of your company is contained. So you'll sign a confidentiality agreement. The investor will go into the data room, look at all the information, ask follow-up questions, go through their diligence process, talk with their experts in different areas of, say, science or intellectual property. And eventually you negotiate a term sheet and an investment.
How long did it take to like, get in the investment? Like I imagine that maybe you got some pushback, or was it for the most part were people kind of on board with your guys' vision?
Yeah, it was really a quick process. I think just all of the excitement about psychedelics really brought in a lot of people. We were fortunate to also just have a great industry environment of people who had also often seen personal change in their lives or the lives of their friends or family through psychedelic therapy, and who were very passionate about the space. And so it wasn't always educating people from ground zero. Often people would know more about psychedelics than I would. So it's different for different investors. Some processes, again, very short, some are longer, but we were fortunate to have a fairly straightforward process.
Are you also you a Penguins fan, Steelers fan?
Yeah, of course. You're in Pittsburgh. You have to,
because I don't think the Flyers are doing well this year at all, honestly. But how
sorry
the
about that.
yeah, what are you gonna do? How the Penguins doing this year?
Well, I don't follow it too closely. You have to be a fan, but a little busy with other things. So I can't tell you their record at the moment. I'll have to
That's
Google it.
okay. What's how do you feel about Kenny Pickett? Do you watch football at all, or
not too much? Again,
okay.
have to be a fan, but just not enough time.
That's okay. Yeah, man. I mean, it's so like exciting. I think honestly, just the whole psychedelic platform in general. I think really because it's obviously like a huge growing field, and so I'm like very excited to see where it goes. Do you think that that purchasing psychedelics like legally, like let's say from a company like yourself, there's still like it would still be available to like people like that would use it recreationally, or is there kind of a hard regulation on only for people with disorders? However, I kind of imagine it where like you can get like with weed, they're pretty, I would say, nonchalant with medicinal marijuana. Like I know people that don't really need it, but they still get it. So do you think that it could be used recreationally one day, or is it going to be strictly used for like mental disorders and things of that nature?
Yeah, we're focused purely on pharmaceuticals. So these are drugs, and they have to be prescribed by a doctor, and it has to be supervised when you go into the therapy. So in that sense, psychedelics are going in a very different direction from cannabis, which I think is good because there's much better science, much better evidence for efficacy in different disorders than cannabis has. But at the same time, we're also seeing this parallel level of regulatory change across the world, across the country. You now have, I think, 2 states, so Oregon and Colorado, where certain categories of psychedelics have been decriminalized. And in those 2 states, there are actually regulated industries. So it's similar to cannabis, where there's still the federal law, but at the state level, you have a regulated industry of therapists and possession that's legal. You have a large number of cities across the U.S. that have also decriminalized psychedelics. As of right now, I think there are 11 states that also have legislation in the works to decriminalize. So I think in terms of that decriminalization, you're going to see a similar pattern to cannabis, but the medical side of things, I think, is going to go very differently, which I think is a good thing.
So I guess it is important to mention then. So again, let's assume you get to human trials. You can't prescribe people drugs. So like you can't just like give them a, a vial of whatever and let them go, right? They have to like come in and you're the one, you have professionals there dosing the patient, and then whatever the conditions are, and then I guess after their trip, then they would leave. Like you can't like just give them a bottle or whatever, right?
That's correct.
Mm,
There are, it depends on the substance and it depends on
mm,
the dose. Again, this is a very broad class of compounds. There are companies doing at-home ketamine therapy.
okay.
So the ketamine is just shipped to the individual. And I believe the dose tends to be much lower there. And so depending on the regulations, depending on the profile of the specific compounds, then some of them may be take home. And I do think ultimately here, this is looking much further down the road and certainly not our focus. But I do think ultimately the wellness markets, so everything outside of pharmaceuticals are going to be, I think they'll dwarf the pharmaceutical market for psychedelics. I think the broader market is much, much larger.
Yeah. I think honestly, what is more like surprising to me is like I listened to a couple of podcasts. Are you familiar with the Andrew Huberman, the Huberman Lab?
Yeah.
Are you familiar with him?
Mhm.
He put out an episode, I don't know, like of like alcohol. So like, and I'm sure alcohol basically has literally almost zero like medicinal benefits. I think it's literally zero. And so the way that, at least in America, like the way that we market alcohol, like, oh, I'm gonna have a drink with dinner, or I got home from a stressful day, I'm gonna have a drink of whatever. And there are compounds such as psychedelics, but also like pharmaceutical drugs that have reputable and a lot of data of positive benefits, and even cannabis, but that is still, a lot of people still like have looked down on it and has a negative connotation, but alcohol is fine. And that is, how do you see that? Do you see that mind flip? Like, do you see it changing at all? And yeah, like, how do you feel about that?
Yeah. Yeah, it's very weird how culture shapes attitudes towards drugs and how the use of drugs actually then shapes the culture.
Mm,
And so I think what we're seeing is just a legacy of maybe Western European culture and alcohol use and the way that interacts with religion and broader culture.
mm,
From what I see, the younger generation, the Gen Z, is much more likely to use cannabis than alcohol.
mm.
I think everything has its risks and benefits. I think we need a lot more research on cannabis. I think the optimal amount of alcohol to consume, according to the research I'm familiar with, is zero. So generally no benefits. And commonly you hear this refrain that cannabis is safer than alcohol, and in many senses that's true, but I think there are also risks here, especially
Mm.
as the potency of the compounds gets higher and higher. There is a risk of psychosis. There are negative effects, and so I think what's needed is a very nuanced and a rational approach to drug policy and to our own personal attitudes towards drugs that
Mm.
considers the science, considers the real risks and the real benefits, and acts accordingly.
Mm. Yeah, so I kind of want to ask you again, like, so how did you get to the position that you are in now? So you graduate from RMU with your MBA, and then you go through many jobs. I think it's like 4 or 5 or something like that. So how did you get to the place where you are now, where like now you're taking on co-founder and CEO? Like, what was that journey like?
Yeah, I started in accounting and consulting,
Mm,
basically. So worked for a couple of the large international consulting and accounting firms,
mm,
and I started in audit at the very beginning. And I went into audit because it's a good way to see many different areas of business, many different industries, and decide where you want to go. And I found the mergers and acquisitions side of finance much more interesting than audit, so pivoted into mergers and acquisitions, and that involved buying and selling companies. It involved the diligence process,
mm,
and that is arguably roughly half of venture investing. So in venture investing, you're buying a stake into the company, you're helping the company grow, and then you're selling your stake in the company.
okay.
So I used that finance skill set to then go into venture, and from venture, I began to take on more of a generalist role. So more of an investments role, more of an operations role in these companies, began to focus more on the biotech side. I was in operations for maybe a dozen or so different spinout companies, different early stage science companies. So had the hands-on experience, and then from the investing perspective, I got to see the full life cycle of the life sciences, from the very early stage companies to the late stage trials, publicly traded types of companies across many different industries. And so that's primarily what built my my skill set, my ability to then kind of go out independently and work with Mindstate.
Now, what was so like what is it about business that like kind of draws you to it? Because like I remember taking a business class sophomore year of high school. I was like, I don't know, maybe one day I'll become an accountant, like 16. And man, I did not like it at all. I didn't like looking at the accounting sheets. I know some people find that very satisfying. I talked to a lot of my business friends who took, accounting or accounting majors in my undergrad. They say it's very difficult, but just something about business that like when people ask me about business, I'm like, man, I would not ask me about, stocks and anything like that. I'm so out of the loop. I use Acorns, bro. Like I do Roundup. I kind of automate all that stuff. I get very excited about STEM. So what is it about business that, was very exciting to you, very appealing to you? And why'd you go into that field?
I think in some sense, everything is business. Everything is sales. You're always, selling yourself. You're always selling an idea, regardless of whether you're in STEM or any other type of industry. So to me, the attractiveness of business was just the generalizability, the ability to take some time to see many different things, to decide what really inspired me, and where my skills and my passions and what the world needs all intersected. So business was just a great platform to be able to explore.
So you seem like the kind of guy that you're kind of at the forefront. You're talking to investors, talking to whoever you need to do to get the business done. How much time is spent like talking to investors? How much time is spent or I don't know, doing something else with the company? Like how is your time, being spent right now?
It tends to go in phases. So there will be a fundraising phase, and really fundraising is a full-time job. In those phases, there will be lots of conversations, lots of meetings with investors. When I'm not fundraising, then it tends to be more balanced, where there's a lot of working with the team. There's a lot of just strategy and communications and operations, lots of proactive planning and meeting people and exploring new opportunities. So it's no day is alike. It's different every day.
So when you're trying to, I know it's kind of difficult because you're still in the early stages of your trials, or animal stages, I should say. And I'm sure it's very busy right now. But when you're not doing this, if you have time, what are some of your hobbies, man? What do you like to do?
I like to go to the gym, like to music, definitely. I've been a guitarist for a long time. I think I'm also very interested in just altered states of consciousness and different spiritual practices. Things like meditation, for example, and float tanks and sweat lodges and all those kinds of things. So just fascinated with the ways in which our perception can fundamentally change, and the ways in which we can make contact with something that is profound or divine in some sense. So I think that's one of my my other obsessions that interfaces very nicely with psychedelics. But,
I was gonna say yes.
A bit ancillary.
Yeah, sensory deprivation things, right? Is that what you're referring to?
Yes.
How does that like feel? Because I've always I definitely want to try that. So how does that like feel? Like, because I mean, isn't it like almost like nothing? Like what's the setup, and how does that work?
Yeah. different people react very differently anytime you're using one of these endogenous methods, right? Where you're not introducing a foreign substance to the body. Individual physiology has a large effect on what actually happens. So some people get in and just say nothing happened. That was extremely boring. And some people have just vivid hallucinations and sensations of flying through alternate landscapes in space and just crazy experiences. But yeah, it's typically a saltwater formulation where you're just floating and the tank closes, so there's complete darkness. And when you remove external sensory input, now everything the brain is processing is just coming from within. And so it's one of the most popular frameworks for neuroscience, for viewing the brain, is viewing the brain as essentially a predictive processing machine. So taking bottom-up input of sensory information and matching it with the top-down prior predictions, so the things you've learned about the world. And so float tanks, sensory deprivation tanks, remove the external input. And so it's kind of maybe the opposite of psychedelics in some way, where everything is then just the top down. So interesting experience.
You don't feel like claustrophobic at all, or you don't feel like, does that feeling ever come over you, or?
No, not me. Some people do experience that though.
Now, for your meditation though, is that I don't know, is it religiously backed, or is it spiritually? Like how do you meditate?
There are many different varieties of meditation, and I'll rotate through different approaches. It's not, I might take a Vipassana meditation. I'm not a Hindu, but I might, use the techniques. And you could argue that removing a technique from its spiritual and cultural grounding has its drawbacks, but yeah, meditation for me, while it tends to be spiritual, I don't tie it to a particular tradition from which it came.
Sure. Well, Dylan, I want to thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate your time and consideration for coming on to the podcast here, and I'm very excited to see what your company does hopefully in the very near future. It would be very interesting to see.
Yeah, that was fun. Thank you for having me on. Hope to talk again soon here.
Absolutely, man. If I'm ever in Pittsburgh, we'll run it up there and go get some Permane Brothers.
Perfect. Hit me
actually, I think it's a little bit overrated, honestly, Permane Brothers, but people out there in Pittsburgh can let me know.
Yeah, you're not allowed to say it, but it's true.
Alrighty, folks. That was episode 29, I think. I'm not actually not really sure, but we'll see you next time.